our second type of heat transfer. Before we get into convection, let's review a little bit about density and some stuff with heat. First of all, heat changes density. So this is going to affect how compact the atoms are in something. If something gets hotter, it's going to expand and get less dense, just like with our gases. When we turn something into its gas form, it has the most energy and wants to expand out. If something gets colder, things shrink and become more dense. So remember, think about low energy. That's like our liquids and solids of that object. It's going to get more condensed. The atoms are going to get more packed together as we lose energy. So convection is a cycle where heat rises and cold sinks. Again, this makes sense. If something is getting hotter, like let's say air or water or this lava lamp, that material becomes less dense and wants to rise up. As it gets to the top, it gets away from the heat source and cools off. It becomes more dense, then sinks back down. You could also think about this like a hot air balloon. The hot air balloon, with the heat engine and fuel, you heat up the balloon so it expands out and lifts up. And then if you want to come down, you just have to cool off the air balloon to let it sink back down to the ground safely. Here are some more examples of that. Sorry about that. In your house, the top of your house is typically wants to be warmer than the bottom. All the heat generally rises up towards the top. And then if you have a cold basement, this might be one of the reasons why. All the cold air sinks back down into that basement. So if you wanted to stay at a normal temperature, at least the house that I grew up in, you would want to be more towards the top in the winter time because that's where the heat would naturally rise. And then in the summertime, you would go to the lower levels like the basement, and it would just be naturally cooler compared to the top floor. Same thing happens with boiling water. Water towards the bottom heats up and then rises towards the top where it bubbles up. And then some of that water will sink back down as it cools off, only to be heated and rising again. When we talk about geology, the inside of the Earth, the convection currents that are driving plate tectonics and things like volcanoes and earthquakes, our core is the source of the heat. It heats up all the magma in the mantle. It rises up and then cools off as it hits the air and then goes back down and sinks because it becomes more dense where it heats up, rises, and keeps going through this cycle. The wind is also another example of this. As air heats up, it wants to rise. Something has to fill in that lower space. Some of that cool air will then come in. And as the air rises up, it cools off, sinks back down, goes back down in the air and rises up. And that cycle is what we know as the wind. The lava lamp is another example. This material is rising if it's closer to the bottom because it wants to rise up. It's hotter, it's less dense. Same thing with the hot air balloon. When you're heating it up, it becomes less dense, it expands out, and it wants to rise through the air.